agus an óra agus tranum a gcuine úsle is mise Garrod O'Kelly. Is mór an onordam or mirth caintóir a Corinahna, Luke McInerney agus Micheál Crowley. Thank you, Nora, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you who have not met me or do not recognize me with my COVID hairstyle, my name is Garrod O'Kelly. It is my great honor to introduce our two speakers, Luke McInerney and Michael O'Crowley. Luke, born in Australia, comes from a family that live on the side of a beautifully scenic hill, Clontinna, on the Tipperary side of Lough Derg, over which I frequently walk. However, Luke and I may have unwittingly crossed professional paths while he worked at the Legal Services Board in London during the 4 years leading to 2014. But it was not until he joined the UK Civil Aviation Authority when his book, Clerical and Learned Lineages of Medieval County Clare, was published that we were first introduced. Can I recommend this book to anyone interested in not only Dalcashian history, but also the link between hereditary learned families and the medieval Irish Church? Luke's family history is rooted in the great Dalcash clan, and as his name suggests, the family were an Earnoch family, Mach an Erne. The Earnoch was a hereditable position as stewards of churches and Thomond lands, which, under the authority of a bishop, Earnochs were essentially the heads of kindred groups who were laterally tenants on certain episcopal lands and were the successors of the ancient heads of religious communities in early Christian Ireland. In addition to his focus on the medieval church history of Gaelic Ireland, Luke's ancillary interests include the economic and social structure of medieval lordships and the role and function of the learned class in Gaelic Ireland. In addition to his focus on Irish medieval history, Luke has a general interest in Eastern and Central European political history and contemporary economics. This is not too surprising, given that he has lived and worked in the Ukraine and Russia. Now, I am informed, but Luke has neither confirmed nor denied it, that he has been asked, as the only Irishman to have lived in both countries, to act as a mediator in the current controversy between the two. We will keep our fingers crossed on that, Luke. That aside, his professional life has involved working in Treasury, which has taken him from his native Australia via London to now being with the Central Bank of Ireland in Dublin. During the past year, Luke was co-opted to the Board of Clans of Ireland. He has had many articles published in local, national, and international historical journals, in addition to his book. Therefore, it came as no surprise when he agreed to take over as joint editor with Catherine Sims of the anthology of the outstanding essays entered into the Irish Chiefs and Clans Prize in History during the past 3 years. This is to be published. The previous one, I hope you have already had, but the one that Luke is involved in is to be published later in the year and will be available through Clans of Ireland or indeed through the publishers Wordwell. In his lecture, Luke will give us a flavour of Ireland through the 6th century down to the end of the era of Baltic Schools and the cessation of the classical Gaelic scholarly system, which occurred in the 17th century. Anish, ligdam tu a cararaig chig Luke.
Guramir Magat a Garod, Futurov Galer, Lucas McInerney is Anam Dom, Agus Inov Tom eg Kent, Fui es Donna, Neheran. So welcome everyone, my name is Luke McInerney, and today I'll be speaking about the learned class of Gaelic Ireland. It is a great privilege to speak to so many of you today, and I thank you for taking the time to attend. I also, of course, commend the work of the Clans of Ireland through promoting Ireland's rich cultural heritage via initiatives such as today's Cultural Summit. Writing in 1600, Moilín Og Mac Bróda, poet and historian to the O'Briens, lamented the decline of the poetic art. In a poem that bemoans the lack of patronage for the Os Dóna, or the learned class, he advises his son not to take up poetry as it promised very little. Instead, his son should remain unwise, even unlearned. From his poem, we understand that by the early 1600s, the whole edifice of classical Gaelic scholarship was under pressure as a cultural and political system, which had supported it for many centuries, was crumbling in the face of the violent Anglicisation of the Tudor monarchs. As the Gaelic lordships which supported a caste of learned poets, historians, lawyers, and physicians were uprooted by the Tudor reconquest, so too were the learned classes themselves. But this was not the whole story, however. Some learned men, and they were almost all men, tried to embrace a new order in which English language, English law, and the English church imposed a new settlement on Ireland in the wake of the defeat of the Gaelic nobles at Kinsale in 1601. What is perhaps remarkable is less about what happened in the 1600s and the ultimate destruction of the Gaelic order and its scholarship, but more about this venerable tradition of scholarship that had existed in Irish for a millennium up to that point. James Carney, the great doyen of Irish literature, wrote that bardic poetry from the earliest times up into the 17th century is a continuum, and its interest as a cultural phenomenon is greater than its detailed expression in any given time or place. Understanding the motives of the learned class is quite remote to us today because a full understanding requires embracing the whole tradition as it was originally expressed. That is, understanding the genealogical schema which linked the main Irish dynasties back to the 5th century. We shall touch on the early beginnings of this literary tradition today, starting from the 5th century and the introduction of Latin writing, which went hand in hand with the advent of Christianity. What I propose to speak about today is to trace some of the contours of that tradition of scholarship and how it changed over time. In doing so, I wish to focus on the so-called hereditary learned families who served as important vessels of Gaelic scholarship in the medieval period, and the extraordinary fact, perhaps unparalleled in Europe, of hereditary kindreds dedicated to the cultivation of learning down the generations. There are different ways to describe this phenomenon and different nomenclature which we may use. I shall be referring to them as a learned class or the professional learned families, and sometimes under the Irish term the Os Dóna. Before we proceed, I wish to note just a few caveats. Firstly, given the time constraints, what I intend to focus on today can only ever be but a slither of the learned tradition. So I'm trying to touch on what I consider the main points. For those interested in learning more, I've included a list of resources in the final slide. For matters of convenience, I shall be referring to the English versions of Irish surnames. So where you might see Mac Bróda or McConnora and O'Dalig and so forth, I shall instead be using McBrody, O'Mulconry and O'Daly. Today's presentation is divided into 4 parts. First, we will touch on the early beginnings in order to understand the context of the learned tradition in Irish. The second part will look at probably the most significant occasion in the development of the learned class, that is the reform of the church in the 12th century. In the third part, we shall investigate the revival of vernacular learning from the mid-14th century to roughly the 16th century. And in the fourth and final part, I will touch on the decline of the tradition in the early 1600s. By the end of my presentation, what I want to impart to you is a sense of the medieval context of these learned families, their origins, development, and the type of literary works which they have left behind for us today. At the end of today's presentation, there will be a Q&A session, so we can broaden this out into a wider discussion. I would just ask if you could please refrain from asking questions until the end. So who were the learned families? I want to preface the presentation by giving some context around what I mean by learned families. When we think of the learned class in Ireland, and I'm specifically talking about Gaelic Ireland, we mean those people who are organized into families or kindreds who over generations were involved in scholarship of a particular kind. As I'll be talking here today about the literary families, we will be referring specifically to those who specialized in poetry, history, law, and medicine. These fields of study were considered in the upper echelons of scholarship, and mastery in them was highly prized and well rewarded. Study in these fields were not clear-cut, however, so mastery in poetry generally meant mastery in history and other disciplines, such as didhanichus, or knowledge of place names. These families were sometimes called bardic families or literary families, but whatever we may call them, they share a number of key characteristics. They pass their knowledge down hereditarily amongst their ranks and through their own schools. They're often also attached to ruling dynasties such as the O'Briens, O'Donnells, McCarthys, and others. And they were exalted in Gaelic society and were rewarded with gifts and tax-free lands and payments. But the most important thing to note is that they were not poets of the kind like Shakespeare or Milton. Their training enabled them to act not simply as poets or as historians, but actually as advisors to rulers, as authors of political propaganda by way of praise poems, for example, or literary narratives. And they saw themselves as representatives of an ancient tradition that stretched back to pre-Christian times. This tradition expressed its cognitive orientation in terms of shenachas, which means historical knowledge that encompasses the study of history, genealogy, and place names. At their height, these families were wealthy and influential. They could move between different patrons without hindrance. They satirized those who didn't reward them, and they were feared. They also served as genealogists and historians, as judges and notaries, and they all did this roughly during the period of the 12th to 17th century. So turning back to our original question, who were the learned families? We have here a list of them compiled by a very member of that class. It was compiled by Dultok McIrvishig in the 1650s. And this list you can see in front of you on the slide. And it's a list of those families whose professional specialization was history. In addition to this list, there were poet, lawyer, and physician families as well. The title of this slide might be familiar to some of you. The term, Ostdorna, means people of the art, and in medieval times it came to refer to the learned class. Now I wish to turn back to early beginnings. The development of the early learned tradition in Gaelic Ireland has ancient roots, dating back to before the arrival of Christianity in the 5th century. The origins of the learned class lay in pre-Christian Ireland to Druids and the Druidic schools. Following the arrival of Christianity, the Irish were quick to adopt Latin as a literary language and studied it intensively in the monastic schools. At this time, the standard of Latin was high, and the expansion of education and literary activity in Ireland is known as Ireland's Golden Age, the so-called Insula Sanctorum et Doctorum, the island of saints and scholars. What was distinctive about the Irish at this stage is that because Ireland was outside of the Roman Empire and the vernacular language was Old Irish, Sean-Gaeilge, Irish monastic scholars had to learn Latin as a second language. In doing so, they devised primers and guides to understand its grammar and complexity. This was necessary to participate in the liturgy, to study the Bible, and to read the Church Fathers. It also prompted the Irish to be introspective in terms of their own language, and so they studied that as well intently. As they had adopted Latin as a foreign tongue, they regarded it as a holy language, like Greek and also like Hebrew, naturally because of the association with Christianity. But in doing so, they regarded their mother tongue, Irish, as of equal worth. So unlike much of the rest of Europe, very early, possibly from the 570s, the Irish produced a body of literature in the vernacular, and they did not eschew it, as was the case with some Slavic and Germanic languages, where native literature comes into the focus many centuries later. By the 6th century, a remarkable synthesis between Latin learning in the church and native scholarship took place. By that stage, there was an early adoption of literacy among the native scholars, the Druids, and this led to the formation of a Mandarin class of learned men who were steeped in Latin Christian culture. Their main contribution was a study of Irish scripture, codification of canon law, and the study of computistics, while others were known for the study of geography and Greek. The monastic curriculum borrowed heavily from the Latin church writings. The etymologies and chronicles of Isidore of Seville were highly influential and provided a model for the Irish in the monasteries to record events in chronicles and annals. This type of activity and scholarship was later inherited by the learned families, and many were responsible for compiling annals down to the 17th century. This synthesis which I speak of is best seen perhaps in the persons of Columcille and Colman mac Leanin. Both were poets who lived in the 6th century, Columcille from Donegal and Colman from Cork. Both men were also learned in the native tradition, which had pre-Christian roots. However, both abandoned their poetry, their profession of poetry, and became monks. In the case of Colman mac Leanin, a famous poet who lived around 8 centuries after him in the 14th century, claimed that his ancestor was the pupil of Colman. In this story, we see that the art of poetry was passed on from Colman mac Leanin, the saint who gave up poetry and his native learning for the church, to his pupil, and eventually found its way to a learned family. The 14th century poet who invoked the memory of his ancestor did so to link his bardic family, the O'Dailys of West Cork, to the great saint and erstwhile poet. The point I'm making here is that there existed a comfortable intermeshing of the native tradition with its pre-Christian roots and with the Latin learning of the church. Indeed, what better way to realize this than in the personnel of the old native learning donning the monastic habit and entering the church and embracing its scholarship. But when they did not simply leave their old learning at the church door. This synthesis can be detected in the literature that has come down to us from the monastic scholars themselves. In the 9th century wisdom text, known as the Triads of Ireland, certain monasteries had developed schools of ecclesiastical learning alongside vernacular or native scholarship. We see that native law was studied at Slane and at Cloyne, and in other monasteries, historical knowledge, or Shenachus, was also the focus of study. We learn from one story reputedly dating from the 7th century that the monastery of Tumregan in County Cavan possessed a school where Latin learning coexisted alongside a school of native law and a school of poetry. Scóil Léinn agus Scóil Fenechus agus Scóil Filiachta, as it's described in the manuscripts. At this monastery, an Irish king spent a period of convalescence after a battle where he found time to study the 3 branches of learning offered at that school. What this shows is that schools of law and poetry were well established by the 7th century. And of course, it also shows that monastic culture had reconciled itself to the native tradition under its roof, and under its roof, different branches of learning, Irish and Latin, could coexist and be studied on equal footing. By the 1800s, we find many texts being written in Irish, and around this time, the famous body of secular law was set out. This extensive collection of law, known as a Shenachus Ma, assimilated pre-Christian traditions and Latin Christianity. This was a remarkable synthesis, and it's similar to what I was speaking about before in terms of synthesis of Latin learning and the native tradition, both which had by this period combined. We mustn't assume that the same monastic scholars, however, were responsible for all of this work. It is generally thought that by this period, the monastic scribes coexisted with the poets and other scholars in a general milieu of learning. As we move into the Middle Irish period from the 900s, we start to see that many of the great saga texts were written down by monastic scribes. The recording of saga texts is interesting, as it recognized that some of them had pre-Christian roots, while others, such as the highly influential text about the peopling of Ireland, the An Lár Gabhála, probably took as its literary model the writings of Christian scholars such as Eusebius's Chronicle or Isidore's Origins. When recording these sagas, the monastic schools probably removed the most egregious pagan elements, and we see from their own glosses they sometimes regarded the legendary stories as legends or as fables, and even in some instances contrary to Christianity. Nevertheless, they felt it important to record them. So successful were these stories as literary models that the Book of Invasions, or the Lár Gabhála, for example, was a standardized text in the later Bardic schools and studied right down to the 17th century. During this same period, we begin to see an interest in synchronizing the rulers of the classical world with those of the Irish dynasties and kings. The Irish synchronisms were written in imitation of St. Jerome's Chronicon. These synchronistic works represented the earliest attempts of Irish monastic scholars to build a historical framework around the origins of the people of Ireland. And we begin to see named scholars from the 9th century onwards, the best known of which was Flann Monastrach, who was based at the scriptorium of Monaster Boyce in the 1050s. Other scholarly works synchronise the Eastern Roman emperors with the Irish kings and shows a real confidence of the Irish in comparing their history to that of universal imperial history. This confidence flowed through to later times when the learned families, very much borrowing from the scholarship of the Irish monasteries, also produced chronicles, genealogies, and annals. So this is a legacy of the Osdorna class and their ancient origins. By the 9th and 10th centuries, we begin to see a number of patterns becoming established. The first is that there emerged a number of great scriptoria, that is, large monastic centres that produced manuscripts, especially in the Irish Midlands and also in East Ulster. Many were established on waterways or on major roadways, trading paths and so forth, such as we find at Clonmacnoise, Terraglass and Lorra. By the 11th century, we begin to see them spread into Thomond, such as at Inishcaltra and Toomgraney. And while naturally the wealth and prestige of these large monastic sites attracted Viking raiders during this period and jealous local kings, there was also a virtuous cycle occurring whereby kings supported the monasteries and endowed them with wealth and with protection, whilst the monasteries, in becoming prestigious, drew into their orb nobles from the kingly dynasties as administrators. What emerged was an increasing specialization of the administrative officers connected with these monasteries. So, for example, from the 10th century, we begin to see more frequent mentions of a class of administrator called an Eretnach. These were quasi-ecclesiastical administrators who managed the lands of the monasteries. Alongside them were the more prestigious corbs, who were administrators, but also combined in their office as being spiritual heirs of the original saint who founded the monastery. And in many cases, the abbots of the monasteries were also corbs. In both cases, the office of corb and Eretnach was often held by families over generations, becoming a hereditary caste of administrators. But the specialization was not just about administration. In the monastic schools, we see at this period many references to lectors, that is, Latin scholars. They were sometimes called by the Irish name, the Far Leon, and ran monastic schools, making them, aside from the abbot, one of the most important officers at these great monasteries, with duties to oversee the scriptoria and its production of valuable manuscripts. Also around this time, the monasteries became more secular, and in some cases, the lectors were not monks, but actually lay scholars, and whose sons would also have a career in the church, either as Eretnachs or as lectors like their fathers. In some cases, we can pinpoint this development and its connection to the latter learned families. For example, the lector of the School of Devenish in Fermanagh was the author of a version of the Ban Hennichus, or the Law of Famous Women, in the mid-12th century. His surname was O'Cashida, and his descendants were the O'Cassidy physicians of Fermanagh. At some point after the 14th century, they changed their profession from being specialists in Shenachus to being physicians. Clearly, there were greater career prospects in medicine than in history. I suppose some things just never change. The crucial point is that by the 12th century, we start to see the formation of a distinct class of literary families, many whose origins lay with these lectors, with the Eretnachs, and also with the corbs. These families began to transmit their learning outside of the monasteries through their own schools, where they taught some of the scholarship which had been perfected in the monasteries. So the next part of the presentation will focus on this new class of literary families. The 12th century was the most critical in the development of the learned families of the medieval period. It is in this century that we identify the origins of the great poetic families of Ireland. The Irish Church was perceived by some at the time as in need of reform to bring it in greater alignment with reforms initiated in the 11th century under Pope Gregory. Among the various issues were two particular problems for the Irish Church. The first was that it had a proliferation of dioceses and these needed to be consolidated under episcopal authority. The second issue was the age-old problem of hereditary succession. In Latin Christendom, recent changes such as the Cluniac reforms took aim at hereditary succession. In the Irish context, this meant that administrators such as the Eretnachs and Corbs were to be reformed or removed. A big step in church reform was introducing continental religious orders, which were previously unknown in Ireland. So these orders include the Cistercians and the Augustinians. What we see by the 12th century is a range of new Cistercian and Augustinian foundations right across the country. If one was to survey the 12th century, what becomes apparent is not only the number of these foundations, but also those older Irish monasteries that were not reformed and which had by that stage either be relegated in importance to the status of parish churches or had fallen out of use altogether. The church or Tarman lands were often transferred to the new foundations. So importantly for our study, these new Cistercian and Augustinian monasteries were less focused on vernacular learning and instead focused on Latin learning. The lectors and Eretnachs, those who are marginalized in these reforms, must have seen the writing on the wall, and despite all of these changes that saw vernacular learning virtually disappear from the monasteries, we get, nevertheless, in the 12th century, a great flowering of scholarship aimed at preserving the learning of the native monasteries. What is quite curious about this process of preservation is that it was a deliberate attempt by these lectors and scholars to gather up historical and antiquarian lore. This is best seen in the large codices such as the Book of Leinster, which was produced in the 1160s, and the Lara Nahidra, which was produced in around 1100. You will see from the image on this slide the opening section of the great epic tale, the Toyn Ball Colna, or the Cattle Raid of Cooley from the Lara Nahidra. This is a good example of an epic tale of the sort written and studied in the old monasteries, being committed to vellum in the 12th century. This act of recording antiquarian lore is the single most important reason why we have any writings in Old and Middle Irish from the early period. I've spoken about the great changes that took place in the 12th century during the reforms of the church. One important factor, of course, was the Norman invasion of the 1160s. The Normans accelerated the foundation of continental religious orders and hastened the decline of the native Irish monasteries through attacks on churches and the seizure and alienation of church lands. They helped frame a context in which disruption and the uprooting of Irish kingdoms meant that the patrons of vernacular learning were being reduced during this period. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. The 150 years from 1200 to the 1350s saw hardly any Irish manuscripts produced. While this situation may owe something to the survival rates of manuscripts, what is really telling about this is that in the previous century saw a whole corpus of texts being written in the monasteries, but all of this stopped around the year 1200. But something was happening in this hiatus of 150 years, even if we don't have all of the details. We know that the language underwent a change, quite a significant change, around the year 1200. We find from this period the development of early modern Irish and its classical literary form. So uniform was the standardization of the language that it is difficult to determine whether a poem, which adheres to the strict poetic conventions set down at that time, was written either in Cork or in Scotland purely on the basis of the language used. The classical literary form of the language was standardized right across the Gaelic-speaking cultural zone of Ireland and all the way to central Scotland, and it was to remain so until the mid-17th century. The standardization of the language suggests that the Irish literary class came together to agree common grammar rules. We do not know precisely how this was achieved, but one suggestion is that there was a regular crinonamad, or gathering of the poets. This may have occurred parallel with another development, that is the spread of the O'Daly poets from Meath and Connacht and parts of Munster, and also across to Scotland, where they assumed the surname MacFurroch. Perhaps the grammar and the literary standards were promulgated by the O'Dalys as they spread out and established new bardic schools. This period saw the establishment of professional learned families. These were the orders of poets, genealogists, historians, and lawyers who became attached to ruling dynasties. Many of these had ancestral links to the lectors and eretnuks who were sidelined in the church reforms, and instead now they had to turn to the Gaelic nobility for new sources of patronage. Some of these families were the O'Dailys and the McGraths, who produced a long line of poets and historians right down to the 17th century. We also see from around the year 1200 the development of court poets, or what's called in Irish the Olive Flaha. By this term I mean those poets whose duty was not simply to produce praise poetry for the local king, but also to advise the king and to act as his negotiator. This was a very prestigious role and was well rewarded to highly trained poets who were masters of their art. Some poets were olives or master poets who held the olive nacht, or the official role as the king's advisor. With this distinction came tax-free lands, a large retinue, and the privilege to be close to the king both at feasts and also to take part in his inauguration. In fact, what is probably the best description of the court poet is the image which is shown on the slide in front of you. This is a coronation of King Alexander III of Scotland in the year 1249. And we see in the image the Olive Rí Alban, or the poet of the King of Scotland, proclaiming the royal lineage, saying in Scots Gaelic, Banach de Rí Albanach, God bless the King of Scots. And he then proceeds to recite King Alexander's genealogy. We can imagine the inauguration of Irish kings such as the O'Connor, O'Neill, O'Donnell, O'Brien, McCarthy, and others with a similar ceremony attended by the Olive Flaha, the court poet. Perhaps as a reaction to this development, in the 14th century, the church launched an attack on the profession of poetry. In response to this, one poet defended the art of poetry and how it was valuable in recording the exploits of rulers and preserving the memory of the ancestry nobility of the Irish. This poet goes so far as to claim that without poetry, the Toba Fis, or the spring of knowledge, would dry up. It would seem that the newly reformed church was careful to manage its revenues, and so was keen to divert the gifts and privileges of the nobles towards the church and rather than to the poets. The fact that this did not go according to plan, however, can be seen by the fact that as late as 1453, a church synod in Limerick decreed that poets were not exempt from paying church tax on their goods. Despite trying to legislate against it, the fact is that the church was unable to remove the privileges awarded to the learned class, as their role and standing had become ingrained in the intellectual and cultural life of Gaelic Ireland. So we've seen how the learned class emerged from the 12th century church reforms to establish themselves as court poets to the ruling Gaelic families. What is striking in any study of the learned families is just how many trace their origins to the monastic scriptoria of the pre-12th century. This has been commented on before by the well-known historian Robin Flower, who first observed that not only did the learned families have historical links to the native monasteries, but there was often to a group of monasteries concentrated in the Irish Midlands. When we look at the origins of the learned families, they tend to be derived from three groups. The first are those with monastic connections. These include the O'Dailys with links to Clonard, the O'Diagans who served as eretnuks at Kilronan in Roscommon, and the O'Keenans of Cleanish in Fermanagh. The second group are those whose ancestors were discarded segments of ruling families, the O'Clearys, the McGraths, the McBrodys, the Dunleavy physicians, for example. We see that the McGraths trace their descent from O'Hearn, brother of King Brian Boru, but only several generations later in 1098, their progenitor was recorded as a chief poet of Munster and appears not to have claimed any dynastic ambitions for the kingship. Many learned families removed themselves deliberately from political competition and instead sought tax-free lands in the role of learned families. This was a strategy of survival for remote and weak branches of the ruling families who otherwise faced demotion in a cutthroat competition for power. The third group are those families whose surnames indicate that they had a progenitor involved in professional learning. So we have the wards, or muck and ward, meaning son of the bard, or the curtains, or muck critin, which means son of the one who plays a crit, or a small harp. The beginning of the Gaelic revival is quite difficult to pinpoint. Generally, however, we can look to events in East Connacht in the O'Kelly kingdom of Ivana to identify some of its early seeds. From the 1350s, two historians and a Christmas feast helped lay the foundation for this great Gaelic revival of culture and learning. Sean O'Dogoin, a historian whose family were long linked to the Clonmacnoise monastery, produced a topographical poem of over 900 lines, which recalled the historical kingdoms of the Irish nobility prior to the arrival of the Normans. His student was a member of the O'Keenon historians, who in 1345 produced a compendium of antiquarian tales, poems, and grammatical tracts. This compendium is the earliest surviving collection of antiquarian material since the 12th century church reform, and it appears that it was a deliberate attempt to connect back to the old learning of the monasteries. This helped set the tone for the Gaelic revival, which produced a massive literature and poetic material, much of which had an antiquarian flavour, a deliberate harking back to the earlier tradition. In 1351, O'Kellig, the ruler of Ivana, held a lavish Christmas feast in which he invited the poets and learned professionals to attend. This general summons, and others like it, helped cement the need for Gaelic rulers to provide patronage to the learned class, and for the learned class to depend on these patrons to support a system of learning centred on their bardic schools. One other poet of this period ought to be mentioned by name. He was Geoffrey Fionn O'Darlig, who, what is quite interesting about this poet is that we know from his poetry that he studied in a bardic school run by the McGraths, probably in the 1340s or 1350s. In particular, he studied with Malwira McGrath, another master poet like himself. So we begin to see the development of professional networks between these families, which were important, which were an important part of a poet's training. So what Geoffrey Fionn O'Darlig is best known for, however, is that he tutored the Fitzgerald, the Earl of Thomond, in bardic poetry. So what we have here is that a ruling descendant of the 12th century Norman invaders was becoming enculturated into Gaelic learning and Gaelic culture. There is perhaps no better way to see this process unfold than a great Fitzgerald Earl versifying in the Irish language in strict bardic metre. When thinking about the methods of training in the schools of the poets, historians, lawyers, and physicians, we know that the curriculum was focused on vernacular studies. There is evidence that local schools existed which provided education in Latin, canon law, and what may be termed the liberal humanities, that is, Latin grammar, philosophy, and the reading of classical authors. But what distinguished the schools of the learned families is their intense concentration on poetry and Shenachus, or history. In the schools of medicine, however, translations from Latin to Irish was also prized, as many medieval Irish medical texts are translations from Latin manuscripts, some whose provenance was ultimately from Arabic medical writings. Some texts refer to the Olives having to commit to memory 350 tales, as well as to know the genealogies of all of the ruling branches of the nobility. The Olives' training was rigorous and would include the mechanics of language, its phonetics, its phonology, its syntax, and vocabulary. We have evidence about the schools themselves. The poets talk about the schools and training in metaphorical terms, as consisting of 3 forges. This notion of a forge comes from the idea that poetry was wrought, just like a smith would wrought iron. They also talk about poems being composed in a house of reclining. As the name implies, this house or room had a singular purpose, where poets would lie on couches in a darkened space to help with poetic composition. Later, the poet would commit to memory and commit to parchment the lines which he had conjured up in his mind. This rather esoteric way of poetic composition is attested as early as the 9th century and continued right down through the period of our study to the 17th century. The best description of the bardic schools which we have was written in the year 1722, but referred to the bardic schools which had operated in the previous century. And I'll just read a small excerpt of that. It says, "The qualifications first required reading well, writing in the mother tongue, and a strong memory. It was likewise necessary that the school should be in a solitary recess or a garden or within an enclosure, far out of reach of any noise. The structure was a snug, low hut and beds in it at convenient distances, each with a small apartment without much furniture, save a table, some seats and a conveniency for clothes to hang upon. No window to let in the light of day, nor any lights at all, but candles. So from these descriptions, one would think that the Baltic schools had changed little from the 1200s to the 1600s. Certain aspects, such as poets composing the darkness, may not have changed much at all. But we also have evidence that schools took place in different environments. Some took place in ring forts and ancient places of settlement. And in fact, we have a line from a poem by Geoffrey Fionn O'Darlig in the 14th century, where he tells us that he's composing from his liss or his ring fort. But by the 16th century, we have references to law scholars copying manuscripts in tower houses. I would speculate that the secure, dry conditions of the stone tower houses proved to be the most usual place of writing, especially during the winter months. There is in the early 17th century a reference to the papers and deeds of the MacClancy lawyers, which were destroyed by fire at their stone castellated residence at Castle Keel in County Clare. Not only was access to light and dryness important for literary activities, but for the Brehon lawyers who were entrusted with the deeds of their patrons, priority was to keep the documents, of course, safe and secure. You can see on this slide an image of the O'Devran Law School, which was in operation in the 1560s. It conforms to the pattern of being a low, snug building out of the way of noise. Also included on this slide is a list of just some of the learned families and the location of their schools. There are others which could have been included, so that what you see before you is just a brief selection. Each one of these families was attached to a ruling family. So for example, the first name on the list, O'Devran, kept a law school in a borough in County Clare, whose legal manuscripts still survive to this day. They were attached to the local ruling family of O'Loughlin, whilst we also have on the list the MacBrodys, who made a significant contribution to Bardic poetry in the 16th and 17th centuries. Their land at Knocknaulbin in West Clare was rent-free, and they also had a library where they kept their deeds and genealogies of the O'Briens in the early 17th century. The land holding of the MacBrodys was in excess of 6,000 acres in the early 17th century, giving us some indication as to the wealth and standing of these learned families. Turning to the last slide of this part of the presentation about the Gaelic revival, we are looking at the types of networks that underlaid and helped foster scholarship among the learned families. The first thing to note is it was an established custom and set out in early Irish law that one of the privileges of poets and men of learning was that they could travel freely between different lordships. This had the benefit of allowing them to receive patronage from different rulers. The poets would regularly undertake a poetic circuit, whereby they lodged with other learned families and exchanged manuscripts. A very interesting poem from 1640 survives, and it refers to a circuit by a Scottish poet by the name O'Murrosoin or Morrison. This poem details the names and the centres of poetic professional learning which stretch from Antrim to Cork. And if we take it as literal truth, it suggests that despite Anglicisation of the 17th century, many learned families were still pursuing their profession at this late stage. The poem rather elegantly describes why O'Murrosoin undertook this circuit to the poetic schools. In verse, it says that he was collecting poetry like a bee stealing honey from every flower. There is a lot of evidence to suggest that members of the learned families frequently exchanged students, and sometimes a number of scholars from one school went on a circuit and lodged with scholars in other schools. The best example of this can be found in the colophons of the law manuscripts written by the O'Devran lawyers of the 1560s. From their scribbles and notes, we can see that they visited the McEgan Law School at Park in Galway and the O'Doran Law School at Ballyorley in Wexford. They also seem quite a mischievous lot, and we have examples of little messages and counter messages recorded in the margins of the manuscripts which they had copied, whereby one scribe complains about having to work on a dinnerless Tuesday, while another, after having copied out the Greek alphabet, bestows a mullocht or a curse on his fellow scholar. And I quote, as it says in the manuscript, He was of a bad help in that and in all other tasks. Scholarly networks were greatly helped along by the obligation of both learned and church families in providing hospitality. They did this through providing entertainment, lodging, and food for guests. By the later medieval period, there is evidence to suggest that these houses may have been separate buildings, set aside for the purpose for where scholars could gather and exchange materials. The annals only begin to mention the houses of hospitality for the learned families from the 14th century, and quite a number of these references are linked to the McEgan Brehon lawyers. By the early 15th century, the houses of hospitality are more frequently mentioned, and some families, such as the O'Clearys, had several of them. While the O'Clearys had their main Baltic school at the castle of Kilbarron in Donegal, they also kept a house of hospitality in County Clare in 1584. They appear again in County Clare in 1595 when Macon O'Clery died at Lettermoylan on Mount Callan. This is a noteworthy reference because we know that another learned family, the McBrodys, were also settled at Lettermoylan, and it seems that the O'Clearys were visiting the McBrodys. This seems quite likely because we know that the McBrodys were related to numerous Ulster learned families, and that two sisters of the poet Taigh Macdara Vacroda married Fergal Mackenward, historian to O'Donnell. Another sister married Donald O'Clery, chronicler to O'Donnell. The point I'm making here is that there existed close professional networks among the Gaelic literati, and in the case of the McBrodys and the O'Clearys, this was strengthened by marriage ties. Now to turn to the last part of my lecture today. It is not possible to deal fully with the complex issue of the decline of the learned families. I term it the decline of the classical Gaelic tradition for the simple reason that elements of that tradition continued and manuscripts were still being written in Irish up until the mid-19th century. Take, for example, Seamus MacCritin, who wrote poetry in West Clare until his death in 1870. He was of a long line of poets and historians who first appear in the Irish annals some 500 years earlier from the mid-14th century. However, what I mean by classical Gaelic learning is the economic and social system that supported the whole edifice of hereditary scholarship and the schools of the professional families. It was this system that suffered in the 16th and 17th century during the destruction of the Gaelic order. The system continued perhaps a bit longer in the Gaelic-speaking regions of Scotland, becoming extinguished there upon the death of the poet to the MacDonalds, Niall MacVarach, in 1726. One of the great last flourishes of poetry in the classical style was a contention known as the Imavah na Fili, or contention of the poets. This was a literary controversy that began in 1616 and went on until the 1620s and included thousands of poetic verses. It was a contention which was started by a poet called Taigh Macdara Vacroda, who initiated a polemic about the merits of the southern half of Ireland and the ancestors of his patron, Donnacha O'Brien, 4th Earl of Thomond. This provoked a reaction from the northern poets, such as the O'Clearys, who took the side of the northern Gaelic nobility against the south. While it appears to have been a bitter exchange of views played out in strict poetic metre, in fact, Taigh Macdara was, of course, related to the O'Clearys, as we saw earlier. So the contention was probably sort of a rallying call for the practitioners of bardic poetry, designed to inflate a national sense of dynastic worth in the face of conquest and dispossession of the Gaelic nobility. At this time, a particularly vocal theme in bardic poetry starts to emerge, which is around the reduction of patronage of the poets. Moilín Og MacBroda, who we met at the opening of this lecture, bemoaned the lack of patronage which he experienced from his historical patrons, the O'Briens. And so much so that one of his poems opens with a rather pessimistic line, "Poverty is death's brother." Moilín Og was right to think this despite his attempts at cooperating in the English-led translation of the Bible into Irish in the 1590s, and despite members of his McBrody family becoming Protestant ministers. But by the 1640s, the McBrodys were all but sidelined. Their efforts to adapt and accommodate to Anglicisation had failed. In other parts of Ireland, the responses of the learned class were similar. In Ulster, the scale of the plantations meant that much of the Gaelic elite had been dispossessed, and the resources to support the practitioners of Gaelic learning was reduced. One Ulster poet condemned in strong verse the plantations and changes that he saw all around himself. In South Tipperary, the poet Mahun O'Hiffanon wrote poems about the decline of the profession of poetry, in which he describes his own journey across Munster in a desperate search of a buyer of his finely wrought bardic poem. To be sure, the profession of poetry continued, and among the remaining practitioners and their descendants, they still regard themselves as worthy inheritors of this ancient tradition. One has the impression that some were allowed to continue until they died off, at which point their tax-free lands and privileges ceased. And finally, it needs to be pointed out that violence played a large part in suppressing the poets. Proclamations made by the English authorities in Ireland in the 16th century targeted the poets for harsh treatment, as they were regarded as fomenters of rebellion, and their verses puffed up the chests of the Gaelic noble classes. To focus just on one example, that of a McGrath poet known as Donecker of the Snows, in the 1580s he provided lavish hospitality to the English Lord President of Munster, where his retinue played music and performed sports, only to face execution some days later by the same English official on the pretense that no honest man needed such a large retinue of the sort which this poet had enjoyed. The targeting of poets undoubtedly caused the loss of many of Ireland's medieval manuscripts. And while around 2,000 bardic poems have survived, the vast bulk of literature must have been lost in the general destruction of property which the Elizabethan and Cromwellian wars unleashed. But there is another story as well. We also find that some members of the learned class served as local officials and tried to adapt to the new order. By the mid-17th century, many of the jurors in the North Clare Manor Courts were from the O'Davern Brehon lawyer family, whose tradition in jurisprudence dated back to the mid-14th century. The expansion of centralized English authority also meant the expansion of the peerage system. Of course, many of the great titles had been conferred on the Gaelic nobility as part of Henry VIII's surrender and regrant policy of the 1540s. By the early 1600s, however, it was necessary for lesser land-owning families to confirm titles of lands under the common law, and so some sought ennoblement through the office of the Ulster King of Arms. In the 1630s, Hugh Og McGrath, who was almost certainly connected to the McGrath Bardic family at Burgess near Kerr in South Tipperary, lodged a genealogy with the Ulster King of Arms in favour of a noble branch of his patrons, the Bartler family. He stated that the genealogy was compiled by him from old and new manuscripts kept by his ancestors. So this is a prime example of a Shanachie at work, albeit in changed circumstances. So the question to ask at this juncture is whether what befell the learned classes in the 17th century was the end of a tradition. Certainly by the time of the reconquest of Ireland under Cromwell in the 1650s, the Baltic Schools had ceased, and the outward display of much of what I've talked about, the houses of hospitality, the tax-free lands, and the privileged social position of the learned class had surely disappeared. However, Gaelic scholarship continued in ever more difficult conditions, but it never enjoyed the same elevated position as before. The growth of Counter-Reformation Catholicism provided one avenue of new patronage for learned families. This can be seen in the context of declining patronage from the ruling families, and so young educated men turned to the church to pursue their learning. Many were attracted to the Franciscans based in Leuven, Prague, and Rome. One Irish Franciscan based in Rome composed a Latin guide on Bardic poetry in the 1670s, which shows that his early education was in a Bardic school. Many continued to write poetry in Irish using the classical meters. However, they usually focused on religious themes. At this time, a great movement was underway by the Irish Franciscans at Leuven in Belgium to collect many of the manuscripts of the learned families. It was this project which gave rise to the collation of numerous chronicles, which we now call the Annals of the Four Masters. Antiquarian works were collated and used to provide information about the early saints of Ireland. For example, a minor branch of the O'Hickey physician family who were settled at Glen Nagullach in the parish of Killaloe, had in their possession in the year 1629 the life of St Cameen of Inishcaltra. But it was the indomitable Franciscan brother Miho O'Claurig who epitomised this movement to collect literary remains of the learned families, and he made extensive journeys around Ireland to copy and collate these writings. As we survey the end of this tradition, individual scholars stick out, one of whom was Geoffrey Keating from South Tipperary, who wrote a popular history of Ireland in Irish in the 1630s. During this period and beyond also lived the antiquarian genealogist Dwaltoch MacIrvishig, who left us one of the largest handwritten genealogical collections ever assembled at over 870 pages. We read in a record regarding the siege of Tromra Castle in 1642 in West Clare that a certain Hugh Macrutin was an observer during that siege, and he was busy taking a note in writing of the activities of the besieging Catholic Confederate forces, whilst, and I shall quote from the manuscript, openly extolling them for their valour. Whilst this writing has not survived, it seems to me that he was producing a Cahram, or a battle narrative, that recorded the martial deeds and military triumphs. This might be taken as one of the last activities of the classical tradition, hanging on there in the penmanship of a Macrutin. Other scholars, such as Rory O'Flaherty from Galway, were not from Baltic families, but received training in the classical learned tradition. And while O'Flaherty wrote in Latin and corresponded with a network of scholars as far afield as Oxford, he drew from the earlier writings of the medieval monastic Irish scholars. So in this way, the Irish vernacular studies enter into a new dimension of Latin intellectual discourse about Ireland's history. Before I conclude today, I'd like to say a few brief words about two poets from the same learned family. The first was Air Bui Macrutin, who in 1717 wrote a book about vindicating the history of Ireland. And this book drew off many Irish language sources and was the first time that a member of a learned family wrote such a work in English. This book was quite controversial among the English, and for that he spent some time in a Dublin prison. 15 years later, Air Bui published an Irish-English dictionary in 1732 in Paris. The other poet was Andreas Macrutin, who's left us a wonderful corpus of poetry. Towards the end of his life, in the 1730s, he dedicated a particular poem to Don of the Sandhills, or Don Maducha. In this poem, Andreas yearns for the old Irish aristocracy, many of whom by that stage were living in reduced circumstances, and he is yearning for them to give him their patronage. In his desperate condition and seeing all around him the disappearance of the classical Gaelic tradition, he addresses his great poem not to any nobleman or human patron, but to no other than Don, the legendary she or fairy monarch of the Tuatha Dé Danann, whose palace was located in the other world, that liminal space between sea and shore, which in the poet's mind was lodged in our deepest consciousness. I shall conclude this lecture by reading a free translation of a section from this poem, which sums up his personal plight, but perhaps can be taken as a plight of the literary tradition, which in the westerly corner of Ireland, on the Atlantic shoreline, had by the 1730s faded to but a shadow of its former self. Beneath these sandy cliffs of old repute, O mighty Don, accept my deep salute. No stranger's greeting to a wretched Gael, to thee I bring but the devout all hail. Of a pilgrim caught by night's cold shade, whose zeal long-suffering has not yet decayed. Thou wouldest return some solacing reply, as in my deep distress to thee alone I cry. Out by the shore, forlorn, I wear away, left like a stranded vessel to decay, or like a gammon table set aside, where neither man nor sporting dice abide, or like poor Oisin, grieving sore and sighing, when all his bands beneath the stones were lying. And nowadays my paths can't trace a true Milesian or one of the Saxon race. From east to west all my native land, on whom for shade or shelter I could stand. Hence, generous Don, thy palace doors unloose, and let the poor forsaken bard repose. Thank you for your attention. Goramarugav.
So articulate and literate. Thank you so much, Luke. Ladies and gentlemen,
Thank you.
we have just been enabled by Luke to stare down the well of learned lineages. In order that we can understand how over the centuries, a complex social network was created out of the great Irish monastic system within the Gaelic order. Luke, you have just helped me to identify how my family, as one such kindred, was associated with, amongst others, the hereditary benefice of Killard in West Clare. I have been able to find the hidden remains of a circular enclosure within the same field as the ancient church of Killard. And also just along the coast, there are the remains of what is marked as a tower house in the 16th and 17th century maps, with the anglicized title Kelly. I would be interested in hearing more about the dwelling places of the Gaelic learned lineages and your opinion on whether they are likely to have transferred their dwellings to tower houses when the rats became obsolete or unfashionable.
Gormil Magat, Gorod. Thank you for the question. Yes, it's a very interesting one, actually, the places of Gaelic scholarship. I suppose my general comment would be it's quite difficult to discern exactly what was the physical manifestations of these places of scholarship, because we have quite a lot of different and sometimes competing evidence. But certainly if we turn our minds to the 1350s and the saga text known as the Cachram Herlig, or the battle career of Turlough, which was written by the McGraths in the 1350s, there is a reference in that text to the olives, to the learned class in the Raths, being in the Ra, in these Raths. There is an argument that by the 13th century, and definitely by the 14th century and beyond, dwelling places such as these, Raths, ringforts, cashels, were fairly antiquated for the Irish nobility at the time, for the Gaelic nobility. Nevertheless, the learned class still appropriated them for their own use. And the reason being because they wanted to connect back to this antique, I suppose, this antique lineage of learning and of place and the connections between the two. And perhaps it's for that reason that even up until the 17th century, indeed 1675, we still see the O'Davran Brehon lawyers occupying Cahermacnaghten, the ring fort, which probably dates from the 13th century or earlier, in the Burren. So whilst in the ring fort they may have had stone houses, etc., they're still nevertheless occupying a much more antique type of residence. But what we do find, and I touched on just briefly in the lecture there, is in the 16th century, certainly some of the scriptoria, the lay scriptoria of these learned families occurring inside the tower houses themselves. From the 15th century, we have a general expansion of tower houses, and the upper echelons of Gaelic society start to occupy tower houses. And that's very evident for the areas of my study, particularly County Clare, where you have perhaps up to 250 tower houses just in that one county. And at the same time, we also find learned families who, the olive of whom, the chief man of learning of those families, also occupying those tower houses. So we have a very interesting reference from 1564 to the O'Davran scholars, the law scholars of the Burren, who I mentioned before, actually celebrating the feast of St. Agnes at Rosmanaha Tower House, and that tower house at that time being owned by Sean O'Mulconra of Ardkyle. That's Sean O'Mulconry, who was a historian. So we see collaboration and the production of texts there in that tower house. And if we look across other parts of Ireland, we also have the O'Clerys, who occupy Kilbarron Castle as well, from the 15th and into the 16th century. And there was a reference that the McIrvishig historians actually built a castle at Lacan, which was their hereditary lands just west of Sligo, sometime in the 15th or perhaps early 16th century. Probably the best example, however, of this would be the McClonacha or the Clancy family from Tradree, which is the area near Bunratty or the Shannon Airport in County Clare. And we see within a circumference of 5 miles, at least 6 tower houses associated with that particular family. A very specific cluster of tower houses there. And I would posit that was the reason for that was that not only were they starting to upgrade their residences to tower houses in the 16th century, but their particular concentration there was to access patronage of the Earls of Thomond, who were at that time based at the castle of Bunratty, close by. So it's quite multifaceted. I think if we go back prior to the 14th century, we'd be looking at most of these learned families living in fairly traditional types of dwellings, also cranogs, which are fortified island residences on lakes. But I would suspect that the survival of a lot of these manuscripts is due to the fact that they were living in stone places, dry places. For those of you who live in Ireland, you obviously are quite cognizant the winter here can be quite damp and wet. Not exactly the best situation for manuscripts, particularly those vellum manuscripts. So I think by the later medieval period, we do see a multiplicity of different types of settlement styles of learned families. Thanks.
Okay, I'm glad. No, I was on another Zoom call there and I turned off the video. Hold on.
Luke, question generally about the learned families and their land holdings. Are there records still existing to illustrate their progress and their decline, perhaps?
Great, thank you, Michael. That's a really interesting question. Yes, there are. There's quite a number of records, essentially in 3 languages. We have records in obviously, of course, in Irish, records in Latin and in English. So if I take my book, for example, a lot of the records which I was looking at was the 15th century papal registers. So these are the supplications or the notices going from the Irish diocese, from Gaelic areas in particular, to the papacy to petition to ask for a benefice or a church living, essentially asking for permission for a cleric to hold a parish. And these supplications were written into register books in Rome, and these have survived and have been translated and published. And so from that, we get a very interesting flow of correspondence, primarily for the 15th century, but also earlier and slightly later up until the Reformation, which can shine some light, cast light on the types of families, what benefices they were petitioning for, and sometimes even there are references to, or oblique references at least, to non-Latin schools, which I take as Baltic schools, and also to families holding these church livings on hereditary terms. So I mentioned earlier the Eartnucks, the stewards of church lands. So some of these, or many of these families actually come into light in the 14th and 15th century papal registers. So that's just one example of how we may ascertain their activities at that time. As I also mentioned, there's a lot of bardic poems. There's just under 2,000 bardic poems. A good majority, maybe half of these or thereabouts have been translated. And in those bardic poems, there's a lot of standard language used, but there are also references to people and places. And in some of these bardic poems, we have references to other learned families and to other Baltic schools. I cited the poem there earlier by O'Murason from 1640, albeit quite late, and he talks about all different areas of schools, etc., which were still functioning in that period. So we can use internal references from poems. By the 17th century, things are a little bit easier. We start to see, because of the expansion of the English administration through war and conquest, we start to see a lot of land surveys. From the County Clare perspective, which I'm probably more familiar with, we have the Books of Survey and Distribution in the 1640s. We have the 1659 Census of Ireland, which also can enable us to identify families, albeit that's after Cromwell and confiscations. And we have a whole series of legal documents. Some of these are stored in Ireland and some elsewhere, also in the 17th century. We, of course, have the fiants from the late 16th century, which are records essentially by the English administration issuing pardons to, in their view, recalcitrant Gaelic ruling families and their followers. And from that, we often have references to rhymers, as in poets, and to chroniclers, historians, and others. So there is quite a lot of evidence. The challenge is, I suppose, sometimes pulling it together. And the final bit of evidence, which is worthwhile mentioning, of course, is the very extensive genealogical collections which survive. We must remember these families were specialists in genealogy. This is part of what they produced. Now, genealogies weren't just about, someone's father's father's father, and they were primarily on the patrilineal line, but there were also records of title, records of land holding as well, and that's why they were produced. Produced in the context of Gaelic society, they took real worth and measure. And we also see with the Anglicisation of the early 17th century and the establishment of the chancery courts, for example, that some of these Gaelic learned individuals also started to lodge these pedigrees and give evidence about landholding when the Gaelic nobility started to change from Brehon law and tried to hold their lands, etc., under common law title. This process actually begins in the 16th century, but we see it really play out particularly in the early 17th century. And there are quite a lot of surveys, inquisitions, etc., into this, both in Latin and in English. Thank you.
Regarding just one further extension of your thoughts, Luke, on this, regarding the group itself, I dare say they were such an identifiable group that there was intermarriage between them. Is this reflected in the pedigrees?
Yes, to a degree. So I referred to some of the intermarriage amongst the MacBroda or the MacBrody historians and the O'Clearys. And for example, we have a very interesting text from 1670, a Latin book, which was written by one of the MacBrodys themselves, who became a Franciscan friar and wrote this in Prague. And the title is Anatomicum Examen. And in this book, he outlines many of the genealogies of his own family, of the MacBrodys, and who they married into. Now, generally in the classical genealogies, it only gives the patrilineal succession. So very rarely do they indicate marriage ties. But for example, this book, as I mentioned, written in 1670 in Latin, there is a particular emphasis on the families that family, the MacBrodys, married into. And we see them marrying a lot of, we see them marrying into a lot of the learned families across Ulster and also in Fermanagh. Yet this family lived in County Clare. So I think it speaks to what I was mentioning earlier about almost a transnational network of scholarship, and also of those ties that bound them together, both scholarly ties and marriage ties.
Hi, Luke. Great lecture, very enjoyable, and
Martin, hi.
Hi, and some great material there on our County Clare Gaelic late medieval buildings. Just on the question of late medieval buildings and medieval buildings, I presume we could say, the likes, when I started researching these buildings, and as you said, about 250 of them exist in Clare, the learned families do appear in quite a number of them. And one that I shared with you recently was a reference that we found to a possible location for the O'Dailys in Finnevera. And the further we go into the research, the more we seem to find in that the O'Hickey residence in Ballyhickey in County Queen, in County Clare, was also mentioned. It was mentioned in Ware's history as having been demolished in 1420, 1450 or thereabouts. And so some of the castles and some of the houses of the lineages, while they're no longer on the ground, we do have indications of possibly where they actually were. And I think that we need to make another visit to the O'Daly site at Finnevera. I think it's definitely worth another visit. So you have the likes of the O'Dailys, the O'Hickeys, and then you have another castle down there in
Very good, Martin, indeed. But yeah, so it's quite interesting. So sometimes what you actually find is a progression, and this sort of touches back on the first question actually by Garrod. So if we look at the McClancy's, the McClonica, for example, they had two key branches in County Clare. Both were Brehon lawyers. The branch which I referred to before was down in Tradree near Bunrutty, and there's another branch up in Corkham Row. For those not familiar with County Clare, this would be near Doolin, up on the northwest coast, on the Atlantic coast of Clare. And there is a Cahir Clancy, in fact, which presumably was their original settlement form. And then later, very close nearby, they built the Tower House of Knockfin and other tower houses in that area. So County Clare is a particularly interesting area for this type of examination, because you can see this, I suppose, evolution of dwelling forms. And perhaps they were still living in Cahir Clancy into the 16th century, simultaneous with the head Olive at the time. And as we both know, Martin, that was Werlock Og McClonica, who was one of the ones who executed the Spanish survivors of the Armada in 1588, and he was living in Knockfin. But it's quite possible that they had both residences. And I think probably it was quite analogous with the O'Daly's in Finnavara, because if you go to Finnavara, you have Park Moor, which is that large circular ring fort, which presumably was also one of their residences there as well. So we might have a situation where they have dual residences.
I think that subject is something that I've looked into in the past, which is the transition from ring fort to tower house. And as you say, Cahir McClancy, the McClancys moved from there, as far as I can make out, to Knockfin and another nearby castle. And similarly with Parkmore and possibly the later house at Finnavara of the O'Daly's. So there is a transition there. There seems to be a transition from ringport, evident from in the learned families.
There does, or indeed what you start to see is an updating of that residence. So an example of this would be the McBrodys of Ibricken, particularly Knockna Alban. So we know on the death of Taig MacDara of Ghroda in 1625, 1626, that his widow held Knockna Alban, and there's a Crenog there. So presumably the family were living on the Crenog as a fortified residence. But we also know that Taig MacDara in 1615 lived at the castle of Dunorgan as well, nearby, also in Ibricken, probably under lease from the O'Briens. So I think the settlement form is quite complicated, and my feeling is it's slightly different for the learned families as it was to the secular Gaelic elite. And what I mean by that is that for the learned families, there was quite a significant emphasis on this antique landscape of connecting back to these ancient areas. I mean, as I mentioned in my lecture today, we have Geoffrey Fionn O'Dalig in the mid 14th century talking about composing poetry from his lists, from his ring fort, and we have other references of that during that period. So whilst yes, I think there was a transition, particularly in the 15th century with the expansion of tower houses, I think there's a deliberate recreating of the past amongst some of these families of also still having, or indeed dwelling in these older forms, these older settlement forms as well.
Look, if I may, this is Michael. I may have a question.
Please.
Does it mean that those poet and bardic families didn't have any immunity in the social, in Gaelic society? In other words, they had to be protected and felt they needed some type of dwelling that would provide protection?
Well, partly perhaps. I mean, generally what you have with the poets and the learned classes is they were held in such high veneration, they were exalted, that they expected protection from their lords. So we have quite a lot of evidence from bardic poetry, particularly by a bardic poet from Ulster in the 17th century, who's in a poem to his lord is saying, "I am your olive, the olive flaha. If I want to I should be like a steady rudder to a ship. I should guide your course in terms of the advice I give you. And in reward, I expect good payment for my poetry. And part of that is that the poets, and he says, we poets seek good land, not this outcrop of land that he was exiled to when he was writing that poem, but land right next to the patron. And that was also about protection, because in that poem, if I recall correctly, he raises the issue of, you know, he's on this outcrop of land. How can his patron, the Maguire, protect him? Protection comes by being under the fold of your Lord, being close to the Lord. And of course, being close to the Lord means that you're more likely to be rendered privileges, etc. And what we do find if we do surveys of Gaelic lordships is the Luchty lands, or the lands, the mensal lands of the lords, their own household lands, they often settled the learned families. So you do see this sort of cascading system whereby you have the chiefly residents of the Taoiseach, or of the chieftain, and around his family in that broader area, you see the learned families. And then as you move further out, then there are other families which are subordinate to the ruling lineage who render them taxes and tribute, etc. So the issue of protection really is one which goes to the patrons. The learned class expected protection from the patrons because they were so exalted. And of course, they had a very high honor price, that a killing of a poet was seen as almost sacrilegious.
Mhm.
And certainly amongst the other bards, or the other learned class, would be almost one to kill a poet would be cursed upon. So, and we see this in 1572 when Conahor O'Brien, the third Earl of Thomond, actually hangs a number of poets. And then he's satirized in poetry and also in the annals. But of course, the annals are written by the learned orders themselves. So of course, they would condemn such an act.